We are very excited because today we are going to be hearing about Julia Margaret Zulver's new book, High Risk Feminism, which not only is an issue that we've been covering for many years now, but an issue that's gotten a lot of attention lately in the press due to the upcoming presidential elections. So we're super excited to listen to Julia and all of her insights about this topic. As everyone knows, Colombia's peace accord was one of the most far-reaching accords when it came to integrating women, gender rights, and LGBT rights. And this became a symbol for most of the world and an example. However, shortly after the accord was passed, there was a plebiscite that lost by a small margin. And one of the reasons that plebiscite was lost, among several reasons, was because there was a lot of criticism to this accord, saying that it was imposing this kind of gender ideology from the outside in Colombia, something that we've debated in other webinars and found that most of the myths that were perpetrated to be untrue. Unfortunately, however, that whole debate did a lot of damage in terms of the momentum that had been formed on advancing women's rights, gender rights, LGBT rights, and that whole aspect of the peace accord. And I mentioned this because also, in spite of this incredible peace accord and its differentiated gender and women focus, and ethnic focus as well, it has an ethnic chapter, we know that for female social leaders, just taking a leadership position or having a role which is different than what is expected in some communities in Colombia can lead to a lot of pushback. And so we're very excited to hear more about this topic, and especially about the communities that Julia details in her book, some of whom we have worked with, like the Liga de Mujeres Desplazadas, who have been incredibly resilient during the conflict and even after the conflict, and who've made such an important contribution to human rights and democracy in the country. So I will introduce Julia. She is Dr. Julia Zulver and is a Marie Curie Research Fellow at the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies and the Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas, UNAM, Mexico. Her work investigates women's high-risk leadership in Latin America with a focus on Mexico, El Salvador, and Colombia. She's done extensive research and has a lot of practitioner experience along the Colombia-Venezuela border, where she works with vulnerable women. She's earned her PhD in sociology from the University of Oxford, and her book, which we're talking about today, and which we'll put a link on how people can all get copies, High Risk Feminism, just came out by Rutgers University Press. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Zulver, and then afterwards we will be taking questions and answers from all of you. If you have questions during her presentation, you can go ahead and put them in the Q&A chat there, and we will address them after she finishes. So Dr. Zulver, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Jimena, and thank you to everyone at WOLA for making this possible. It's fantastic to have the opportunity to speak to you all today. I often usually speak to primarily academic audiences, so I hope that there are some policy people too in the audience. I've tailored this presentation a little bit more in terms of not only explaining what the findings of my research have been over the last 5-6 years, but also what the implications are. And I think that now, in this moment right before the elections, particularly with the possibility of the rise of candidates like Francia Marquez, some of these implications come to light even more than perhaps when I was doing the research. So I'm going to share my screen here. There we go. So as Jimena mentioned, the book, which is now available and we'll share it, is High Risk Feminism in Colombia, Women's Mobilization in Violent Contexts. And this book came out of my PhD research. I began in the first time I was in Colombia doing some of this work was 2015, but the bulk of it started in 2016. And it went through until 2019, although I remained in the country until about 4 months ago when I moved here to Mexico. So as the rounds of edits continued, the insights continued to develop and go into the book as well. But I'm going to begin just by reading one of the stories or one of the narratives that opens the book. You see here, this is the picture. This picture comes from probably September 2016, right before the peace referendum that Jimena mentioned earlier. So Angela and I were sitting on a bus, traveling from Turbaco to Barranquilla, when she decided to share her story with me. We'd met a few months earlier when I first arrived in Colombia, and although we'd spent lots of time together, she'd never chosen to open up to me about her past. Originally from Magdalena, she and her husband were displaced from the countryside to an urban center after her family members were murdered by paramilitaries. It was in the city that her husband was killed, and she then had to move to El Pozón, a slum near Cartagena, with her children. This was where she joined the Liga de Mujeres Desplazadas, the League of Displaced Women, and moved into the City of Women. Her second husband was murdered on the doorstep of her house when their youngest child was only 6 months old. She told me about the early days of the city, when the women continued to be threatened by armed groups. Her words were clear. Despite so much pain, so many violations, so much damage, the voice of us women has always survived. We had woken up early and we were en route to a rally where women from all over the Caribbean coast would come together to express their support for the peace accords negotiated between the Colombian government and the FARC. It was a moment of expectation, full of hopeful symbols, women wearing white, images of doves of peace, t-shirts with brightly colored messages of sí, yes. Angela told me that she had been reflecting on what this day meant to her. Behind every smile, there is a story, she told me. And then years later, at the opposite end of the country, Sandra and I were sitting in the office of a local government employee in southern Putumayo, near the border with Ecuador. The fan on the desk created a background of white noise that at times made it difficult to hear her, particularly when she lowered her voice as she talked about memories of the past. I asked her if she could tell me a little bit more about how she had come to join the Alianza de Mujeres Tejedoras de Vida, del Putumayo, the Women's Alliance of Putumayo, Weavers of Life. She delved into a story that involved kidnap and sexual abuse as a young woman. It was this experience that eventually led her to join the Alianza, where she was finally able to talk to other women about her experiences and find solidarity in group membership. For her, the traumas of the past were an intrinsic part of the reason she joined the Alianza. But being part of this organization is dangerous for Sandra today. She told me that only a few months before the interview, when we were speaking, armed men had entered her house and told her that unless she stopped her community work and joined them, they would kill both her and her daughters. While our conversation focused on resistance and resilience, it was clear that times were tense. As soon as we left the building, we were accompanied by her government-issued bodyguards who followed us a few paces behind as we walked to a small restaurant located on the edge of the town's central plaza. The next time I met up with Sandra in late 2019, she was no longer in the South. The threats had become too much, and she'd been forced to displace herself to the departmental capital of Mocoa. So I begin with these narratives and these stories to really underscore the kind of overall ethos or the overall way that I decided to present the research in this book, which is directly from the voices and experiences and narratives of those grassroots women who are working in Bolivar, in Putumayo, in the localities in the south of Bogota, in La Guajira, but all over the country, not only during the context of the armed conflict, but also now in the post-accord moment. For those of you who don't know, I'm going to go really quickly through a little brief history of the Colombian conflict, although I'm sure if you signed up for this presentation, you probably already know quite a bit about the context that I'm speaking about. As I mentioned, or kind of foreshadowed towards, after almost more than 5 decades of armed conflict between the government of Colombia and the FARC rebels, between 2012 and 2016, there was a peace process, a peace negotiation process, which culminated in 2016, as Jimena mentioned, with a referendum, which was narrowly won by the no side. But Juan Manuel Santos, the president at the time, and his government went through, made some adjustments and changes, and it was passed through both houses of the government by the end of 2016. However, we know that during the conflict, gendered violence was rife. And so of the over 9 million registered victims through the country's transitional justice mechanism, more than half were women, particularly when it comes to crimes related to displacement. We also know that there have been, through this same transitional justice mechanism whereby victims can register that they suffered in the context of the conflict, there have also been 34 registered cases of sexual violence, which we know is probably a low ball, given all of the different barriers around coming forward and registering as a victim of sexual violence. However, in the aftermath of the peace accords, what we've seen since 2016, 5.5 years later, is a reconfiguration of the armed conflict with multiple other actors, both old actors, so different rebel groups, different paramilitary groups, different narco-trafficking groups, and some newer groups as well coming in to fill power vacuums that were left behind by the FARC, who did demobilize in large swaths of particularly rural areas of the country. INDEPAZ, which is a think tank based out of Bogota, has registered the murder of 59 social leaders in this year to date. And that's not to mention the acts of forced displacement, of other massacres, of effectively lockdowns where people have to stay inside their houses and are not allowed to move around the territories that they live in. And these murders of almost 60 social leaders bring the total since the signing of the peace accord to over 1,000. We also know, both in terms of the academics in this conversation, but also the policymakers, also those who are activists who are working day to day in these contexts, that gender and conflict exists along a continuum. And so Cynthia Cockburn talks about this in terms of the kinds of violence and also the occasions of violence. So she says that men and women die different deaths and are tortured and abused in different ways in wars, both because of physical differences between the sexes and because of the different meanings culturally ascribed to the male and female body. And Donnie Meertens, who I think was at the Javeriana for many years, has really well documented the way that different crimes and different acts of violence within the context of Colombia's armed conflict impacted women in different ways, not only in terms of dying different deaths or being tortured in different ways, or even suffering sexual abuse, but again, when it comes to displacement, what it means to have to uproot yourself as a family, as a head of household, perhaps as someone who's been recently widowed and moved to a different territory. She really gets into the gendered differences that men and women experience when they go through these situations. And then Cynthia Cockburn also talks about not only gender and conflict or gender and violence on this continuum in terms of the kinds of violence, but also in terms of the moments or occasions. So she says that sometimes the post-war period is better called interbellum, a pause before fighting begins again. And I think that given the context I just shared with you about what social leaders, particularly women social leaders, are facing in this moment in Colombia, I think that we can be quite clear that although Colombia was signed this peace accord 5.5 years ago, it's not necessarily a context or a situation that anyone that I work with would, willingly or readily refer to as peaceful. And so in the face of these high risks of ubiquitous violence during both post-conflict and nominally post-conflict moments, there may be an assumption that women turn inwards into the private domain of the home in order to take care of themselves and their families, to protect themselves. We also may think that as a function of fear of violence, socially dictated norms around what it means to be a woman and what women's roles are, social isolation, lack of knowing how to mobilize, that women may not actually have these resources to mobilize or to act collectively. However, the spoiler alert, which again is not much of a spoiler at this point, is that this is not always the case in Colombia. just to be clear, when we bring in this question of women or gendered power dynamics and how they impact women in the context of Colombia's armed conflict, what I could identify through my research and others have identified is that there are three ways or three kind of levels to the threats that women are exposed to when they contest the violent dynamics of the territories in which they live, when they choose to push back against these controls, these social and territorial controls that are being imposed by various armed actors. So the first is that they're daring to disturb imposed social order by mobilizing in the first place, in places where armed groups don't want anyone to mobilize. They don't want any social cohesion because that prevents them from having this monopoly over the territory and the people who inhabit it. Secondly, when women decide to engage in this collective action, they're transgressing socially acceptable gender norms. So that means that when these armed groups see that women's roles should be in the home with the children, cooking, cleaning, it certainly means that they shouldn't be out engaging in protests or making demands on state institutions or on these armed groups. And then thirdly, the third layer is that the women who I work with are not only daring to contest the social order that's being imposed by armed groups, they're not only women who are doing that, but they're actually making demands for women's rights and gender justice. And that's the icing on the cake when it comes to the kinds of violences that they're exposed to in retribution for engaging in this kind of mobilization. So the question that my thesis and now this book, which has built off the thesis, seeks to answer is, how do we explain why women put themselves directly in harm's way by mobilizing? Why, when the response to acting collectively can be threats, stalking, violence, threats against family, displacement, murder, do these women decide to assume the risk and mobilize anyway? And so what I needed to do in order to answer this question was to put a gendered lens on high-risk collective action. And what I found through the case studies that I'm going to talk to you about in the next few minutes is that leadership is critical when it comes to convincing a specific population to mobilize, despite the risks that this entails. So these amazing, fantastic women leaders come into communities or appear in communities, and they form what is called a charismatic bond, which basically links them in this powerful way to people who are engaged or who are living in these territories, who are suffering violence, but perhaps don't know how to mobilize themselves or organize themselves. And what the leader does is that they have the ability to frame the comparative benefits of mobilizing to those who are operating in this domain of losses. So I'll break that down. Effectively, what this means is that these charismatic leaders have a really special way of showing people living in their communities, women living in their communities, that if they don't mobilize, if they don't join the organization, they don't join a group, that doesn't actually guarantee them much safety. Simply being a woman living in these controlled territories means that you're at risk of violence, because violence against women and gendered forms of violence are used as tools of social control and territorial control by various armed groups anyway. So just being a person, just minding your own business, staying in your house, doesn't actually mean that you're safe. And when you come to look at these groups or these women's organizations, sure, sticking your neck out, becoming part of a group definitely does come with additional risks. It shines a little spotlight on you as someone who's transgressive, someone who's breaking the rules perhaps. But what the leaders do is they don't frame it in terms of that added risk. They frame it in terms of the added potential benefits of joining joining a women's group. And those benefits are both material and non-material. When I talk about non-material benefits, what I mean is collective identity. So feeling as though you're not alone. These bonds of group membership, knowing that you have someone to rely on, someone you can talk to, someone who went through the same experiences of violence that you did. And through that, there are, and I'll get into this again, particularly when I talk about the case of Afromupaz, there's an ability within these group settings to realize that what happened, be that sexual violence or other forms of gendered violence in the context of armed conflict, had nothing to do with you as an individual. They weren't your fault, they weren't something you deserved, but they were actually part of a bigger strategy that was imposed upon you simply for living in the territory. And then when I talk about the material benefits, what I mean here is that being part of a group means that you have access to specific resources. So for example, as a collective, you can apply for collective reparations as opposed to only individual reparations. Or in the case of the Liga de Mujeres Desplazadas, you can come together and apply for projects from international funders, like different institutions within the United States, to get money and resources to build the City of Women, which I talked about really briefly in terms of Angela's story, and I'll talk about a little bit more in the next few slides. But if you don't join the group, you don't have access to these benefits. And so what the leader does is they say, here's the level of risk if you decide not to mobilize. It's not zero, it's here. If you don't join us, you're just living in a dangerous place and you have no control over that. If you do decide to mobilize, sure, the risk differential is here. You are going to be exposed to more risk because you're making noise and you are shining light on a problem that the armed groups who are controlling this territory don't want you to highlight. But the potential benefits make this extra risk worth it. And that is why we see these women coming together in different parts of the country, participating in high-risk collective action that at face value might not seem logical or rational, but when framed that way by a charismatic leader, clearly is. And so here we are. Directed by a charismatic leader, the women operating in these conditions of violence strategically engage with 4 pillars of action. I'm not going to get into them today, they're in the book, but effectively they are around building collective identity, generating and forming social capital, both within the group and also with external actors like institutions who can provide resources, like protection organizations within the institutions of the state, like transnational advocacy, human rights groups, and Winifred Tate writes a lot about that in Putumayo in a really compelling way. The third is engaging in legal framing strategies. So that effectively means figuring out and coming together and filing court cases, engaging in filing denuncias, using the language of the state and the laws and the autos and the actas of the state itself and its legal architecture to frame what has happened to these women as illegal, and also that it demands a response because the state has certain responsibilities towards the people who have suffered in the context of conflict. And then the fourth is active certification, which is effectively going out and participating collectively and making the organization an actor that needs to be taken seriously. So that can look like sit-ins or tomas or takeovers of government offices. It can be participating in marches and protests. It can also be having events or participating in cultural fairs, which show to the neighbors or to the other people in the community who you are as a unit, as an official organization, and that, as I say, requires taking seriously. And so these women come together and they contest their violent surroundings and they demand a more gender-just society. They turn their fear into anger and resistance, which shifts their perspectives on risk-taking. Again, that differential that I was talking about, and effectively facilitates their participation in activities that from the outside we may consider too risky or too high risk. So I'm going to go into now just briefly going through the cases because I do want to focus on the policy prescriptions that come out of the book. The first case that I looked at is the Liga de Mujeres Desplazadas. In Turbaco, Bolívar, there is this small kind of city, this small kind of subdivision, and it's called the City of Women. And effectively this manifested because the women like Angela, who arrived in El Pozón in the late 90s and early 2000s from all over the Colombian coast, arrived and continued to be victimized by ongoing dynamics of armed conflict. But slowly they came together and they started to really informally meet each other. For example, by making a sancocho so that they could all feed their kids. So someone brings the carrot, someone brings the potato, someone brings the piece of chicken, and they all put this into the pot, they make a soup, and they're able to stretch out their food so that all of their kids can have something to eat. And in this context, Patricia Guerrero, who's a lawyer, showed up and started to not only talk to these women about meeting their practical needs in terms of making sure their children were fed, but also about more strategic needs. And she began to explain to them that as women, they have rights, and as victims of the armed conflict, they have rights. And so she began to create these bonds of collective identity, to engage in this social capital building, not only within the organization, but also outside. And eventually she asked the women, what would it take for you to have a dignified life again, your sueño de una vida digna? And they said, we want homes. We don't just want houses, we want homes. And so they decided to make the City of Women. Patricia Guerrero had the ability to speak to a US senator who facilitated resources. And these resources came down to the hands of the Liga, and they learned how to level out terrain. They learned how to make bricks. They learned how to build these houses. What they couldn't do themselves, they hired out and contracted others. And they built this neighborhood where the women had the deeds to the house and where they knew that they would feel safe with their families. However, being in the City of Women didn't necessarily guarantee safety, even though that's what they were dreaming of. As they were building the city, the threats continued from other armed groups who didn't want them to be in Turbaco, in this part of Bolivar. Really, unfortunately, one of the women's husbands was killed while he was guarding the brick factory. And as I said, Angela's husband was actually shot on their front doorstep in the City of Women. So, violence continued, but the women's mobilization continued. They continued, despite these threats and risk and fear, to make demands, not only for their houses, but also for collective reparations, from recognition from the state and from international organizations and institutions like the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And they continued to demand a more gender just society. In a different part of the country, a very different part of the country, in Usme, in the very south of Bogota, I worked with another organization called Afromupaz. Now, Afromupaz is an organization made up of women who were all displaced from the Pacific coast of Colombia in the same time period, late 90s, early 2000s. And they showed up, some by way of Cali, some by way of Medellin, to Bogota, to this big, cold, rainy, and highly racist city, not knowing what to do or how to support their families or how to make ends meet. One of the big issues was that lots of these women were unable to get jobs. They told me that they'd show up for job interviews, and because they're Black women, they would be told that they were not suitable for the position. And so these women began to coalesce around one leader called Marie Skłodowska-Curie. And she had a history of mobilizing within the displaced Afro-Colombian community. But what she noticed is that when she was participating in these mixed organizations, often, and mixed in terms of men and women, often the women's specific needs weren't always front and center of the demands. And so she found that it was really necessary to make not only an organization that she could include women's particular needs, but also Afro-Colombian women's particular needs. And so they came together in the late 90s, and they rented a house. And in this space, they found a way to employ these women who weren't able to find jobs. And so that was through cooking, through making soap and beauty products, through sewing. And although the women didn't get a wage necessarily, they at least had somewhere safe to be. They had food, they had a breakfast and a lunch, they had somewhere safe to leave their kids while they were working. And they eventually started to come together again, not only around these practical needs, but also around more strategic needs, like women's rights, like reparations through the transitional justice mechanism and law. And also around psychosocial healing. They realized that they were unable through through kind of more Western or institutionalized methods, like going to the psychologist, to overcome what violences they'd suffered. And so as a group, they developed this 14-step program that drew on traditional elements, traditional medicine, traditional healing from their communities. And they developed this 14-step healing or sanación program that the women began to participate in. Again, though, this was not necessarily a safe place for women to continue to mobilize and make demands. In 2010, Maria Eugenia and her sister were kidnapped from Usme, from the house where they were working, and they were taken to Mosquera outside of the city, where they were repeatedly violated as a warning, and as a warning to the other women in the organization, not to stick their noses where they shouldn't. Largely this came because Maria Eugenia and the women of Afromubas were starting to denounce child recruitment in their neighborhood, and also the trafficking of drugs, as well as denouncing particular people who had enacted violence on them, not only in the Pacific, but also in Usme. But Maria Eugenia and the organization continued to draw on this sanación, to draw on the bonds that had formed between each other, and to continue to make demands on the government for gender justice and for collective reparation. And after I stopped working with them and stopped the bulk of my field work with them, they actually did get collective reparations in the form of a meeting house and the form of a number of supplies to go into this meeting house. So sewing machines, an area where their kids could be, the ability to really kind of deck out this kitchen so that they could continue in their catering ventures. And they really continue to push despite these ongoing risks, these ongoing high risks of the types of feminism that they were enacting and that they were promoting. So in research design within some of the social sciences, we focus not only on positive cases, but also on negative cases. And I say negative cases not to put any normative value on it, but to kind of explain a case in a really similar population where we didn't see high risk feminism. And what that helps us to do is explain what factors were important in the cases where we do see high risk feminism. So I spent time with a neighborhood group, let's say, in La Soledad in La Guajira. That's not its actual name, but the violence there is such that the women I worked with didn't want to be identified. And so it's a invaded neighborhood, invaded area outside of Riohacha. And while there was nominally a leader and someone who I worked with and spent time with, and who did have relationships with other women in her community who were very similar demographically in terms of socioeconomic class, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of age, in terms of education, in terms of where they'd come from, the violences they'd suffered. She did have bonds with some of them. She did have friendships with some of them. You know, we spent a lot of time in this patio chatting and drinking juice and talking about the neighborhood, but they didn't actually engage in any kind of demand making towards institutions like the government. And the reason that I found is that the leader, while she was a good leader and she was a kind leader and she was someone who had the ability to chat with other people in her community, she wasn't really a charismatic leader in the way that Patricia and Maria Eugenia were, in terms of their ability to really focus in on those non-material and material benefits which can justify the increased risk taking. And so these women would hang out, they'd chat, but they didn't really have any kind of big goals or bigger kind of actions or projects they were looking for, despite having a lot of similar characteristics to other organizations. And then finally, I spent time working with the Alianza de Tejedoras de Vida in Putumayo. So this was Sandra's story that I spoke about at the beginning. And interestingly, I actually met the women in Putumayo later. So I met them in 2018, 2019. And what they talked to me about was that after the peace process was signed, they had this moment where they could breathe a sigh of relief, where they could say, okay, you know, things in our territory are feeling more peaceful. They had had really similar experiences to the other organizations. They had started to mobilize in the late 90s, early 2000s, during a particularly dark and violent moment of paramilitary incursion, which was supported by the armed forces against territories that were supposed to be sympathetic to the FARC. And some of the kind of worst stories and massacres of the armed conflict were taking place in these communities. And then as the paramilitaries demobilized through a questionable demobilization period from 2005 to 2007, things got a little bit easier for these women. Things got a bit safer in their communities. And then as the peace negotiations began, 2012 up to 2016, they were able to actually work quite openly in their communities, promoting women's economic empowerment, promoting women's rights, making denuncias against those people who had violated them in the context of conflict. But what Sandra will say, and the other leaders, Fatima will say to me often, is that around 2017, 2018, things started to go back to the way they were before. And again, that's when going back to that slide where I explained a little bit of the context of the conflict, we see that these power vacuums that were left when the FARC demobilized began to be filled by other and recycled actors who were looking for social and territorial control. And in this context, the first people that they started to threaten, or the first people that they started to really go after to make an example of them to other people who maybe potentially were thinking of starting to engage in any social activism, was the Alianza. And that's because the Alianza was, it was there, it was public, they were making public demands, they were successful, they had good ties with certain members of local government, they had somewhat of a national name for themselves. And so these armed groups specifically started going for them to just cut at the root that there could be any kind of social cohesion. But what we also see, again, going back to that dynamic of women mobilizing, is that we see almost this patriarchal backlash, which I've talked about in some other research I've done, whereby not only were they trying to use the Alianza as an example to other organizations who may have considered mobilizing, but they were also actively punishing them for having made demands that women shouldn't be making. So rights, demands around women's rights, around gender justice. But even just the act of being out and making public demands is not a woman's job or where a woman should be. And so there was this level or this dynamic of punishment, which kind of highlights some of the internalized understandings of gender norms that these armed groups do have. And so to get into the policy implications here, and Jimena did mention this in the beginning, the Kroc Institute has this barometer initiative, which they use to monitor the implementation of the accords. And as Jimena mentioned, these Colombian peace accords were seen as the most gender sensitive in the world. They were seen as, the pinnacle of what it means to have women's rights and women's voices included in a peace negotiation and peace accords, what it means to have LGBT rights included, what it means to have ethnic rights included. And I took this from a July 2020 report, but I'm sure it's been updated since then. At that point, in July 2020, 32% of the gender provisions had not yet been initiated in the peace process at all, whatsoever. And 40% had only been implemented to what was considered a minimum level. So for all that this looks great on paper and for all that this existed in the imagination and in the negotiating table, it wasn't being implemented in practice. And so what I've learned and what comes out of this book and speaking to women who are on the ground at the grassroots level in very rural communities is that there needs to be an ability to center women's experiences of conflict at the heart of policy response. That might sound kind of like word salad or might not actually sound like anything concrete, but I will get into some concrete examples of what that could look like. So effectively, one of the main things that came out of my research is that peace building, this notion that comes in large part out of the Women, Peace and Security agenda and the 10 resolutions that have been ratified since 2000, when the Security Council signed the first resolution, 1325. There's this acknowledgement that women and men suffer conflict differently. Women and girls, men and boys suffer conflict differently based on gender, based on those social meanings ascribed to what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. And also that women have special roles both in negotiations of peace accords, but also in post-conflict reconstruction. And that it's important, that it's vital that women are out there engaging in peace building in their communities in the aftermath of conflict. That's fantastic. It was a big leap. It was this monumental resolution that came out in 2000 and then has been updated since. However, what's not really included in there, or is only being given more kind of recognition lately in the last few years, is that peace building is very dangerous work, especially when it's linked to the promotion of gender justice. As I said, the case of the Alianza is a clear example of this. Not only were women being targeted by armed groups for being peace builders, but also there was a retributive or punishing kind of element to it in terms of putting women back in their place. And so there are three kind of implications or three categories of implications that I'm going to talk about at the policy level. One of them is the need for context-specific analysis or localization of women, peace, and security agenda. And what that means is effectively talking to women about what contexts and communities they inhabit and what those security risks are to them. For all that the women in Bolivar, in Putumayo, in the south of Bogota, and in La Guajira were suffering similar kinds of violence, their contexts and their communities are also very different, with very different armed actors, configurations of armed actors, presence or not of coca or of illegal mining or of trafficking routes. And so what's really important is asking and being aware that these risks shift on an ongoing basis. What the security situation was in 2016 is not the same as it was when I was doing my research, which is not the same as it is today in this build up to the election. So there's a real need for a gender security and conflict analysis, which includes those voices on the ground, not in Bogota, not in Washington, not necessarily in New York, although those voices, of course, come with high level and kind of top-down expertise, but also from the bottom up in terms of day-to-day, what are the risks that these women are facing? that also has to have a gender lens on it. Because often if I talk to the women, for example, in Turbaco of the Liga, what their day-to-day biggest threats were, they would say in the same breath, you know, I'm worried about the paramilitaries who are coming in and recruiting. I'm worried because the Navy came in and started abusing some of our teenage boys. I'm worried because I can't pay the light bill. I'm worried because I don't have money to get on the bus and take my child to the hospital. And so although these may seem like very different understandings of what it means to be secure, they are on this spectrum or on a similar understanding of how women's lives are rendered vulnerable in these conflict and post-conflict settings. And so that feeds quite nicely into my point about sustainable and flexible funding and monitoring and evaluation. There was, in the aftermath of the peace accord, this huge influx of international money to kind of bolster up and support what it meant to implement the peace accords. However, development has a quick turnover. You know, a lot of international embassies, for example, different countries or different international organizations have quite turnaround. They want, you know, a 6-month, 1-year project. They want results. They want to quantify these results. And we're talking about women who often don't have cell phone service because they live in rural areas. And so their ability to sit down and write out a proposal that fits within the Excel documents that come from out of their context is not always great. That doesn't mean that they don't have localized expertise and localized knowledge. It just means that they're not NGOized, as Sonia Alvarez might say, or perhaps formalized in the way that other bigger and more technically advanced organizations are. And so what that requires is not only that this funding comes with a certain level of flexibility in terms of how to report, how to spend the money, but also in terms of flexibility in the terms of shocks. So we saw, and I had an article in the Bulletin of Latin American Research come out, that as soon as COVID hit, what that meant for women in rural areas is that their access to justice effectively shut down. They were isolated in their communities, and the armed groups who were operating in their communities really ramped up the work that they were doing and increased their use of violence. And so without the ability to access justice, and also in the face of more violence, these women were exposed to heightened risks. And I mean, it's perhaps not surprising, although it's incredibly sad, it's devastating. But on the first day of Colombia's lockdown, we saw the murder of a woman social leader in Bolivar, precisely because she had been out in her community doing a census about which families needed food and which families needed to be supported, as they knew that they were going down into a lockdown. I think also going back to the question of gendered conflict and security analysis, this has real implications when we think about Colombia's National Protection Unit. This is a unit that allegedly supports those who've been threatened. There are different kind of levels. So this might be a flak jacket, a bulletproof jacket, and a cell phone. It might be a car, an armored car. It might be bodyguards who come with you. But the women I talk to on a daily basis say, you know, they live in incredibly hot areas. They live on the Caribbean coast. They live in Putumayo in the jungle. So wearing a bulletproof vest at all points in time is not feasible for them, let alone comfortable. You know, having a cell phone. One woman said to me, like, great, so when my attacker comes, I just get out the phone and make a call. Like, that's not really going to protect me when push comes to shove. And then finally, having these bodyguards or having these cars means that women are actually removed from their communities. Many women have told me, I can't go into my territory. I can't go to the vereda. I can't go to wherever it is that I usually go and spend time with the women in my organization, because I'm in this big car and I'm coming with strangers. I'm coming with hired security personnel who I don't know where they've come from, and the community's afraid of them, and the community, you know, doesn't necessarily trust them, and then actually starts to question their trust in me. And you know, I'm not necessarily even coming with the policy prescriptions. What should this look like? A lot of these women's organizations already have documents and suggestions and caracterizaciones which outline precisely what they want in their territories and how that would better ensure their security at a local level, in terms of the regional dynamics, and also at the national level in terms of their ability to get access to these resources that they're supposed to get as peace builders in fragile communities. And I'm really happy to talk more about this and get into a bit of a discussion about it in the Q&A. And this is, you know, a mural, a protest that I saw in Bogota in January 2020, but it's one that I really remember and really stood out to me. Ser líderes sociales de alto riesgo. It's a high risk activity to be a social leader. And I mean, I think that we see this really personified in Francia Marquez right now. And I know that we're going to chat about her a little bit more too. So just to finish up, there's two things actually I want to read. One, or that I want to say, one is to say that the book is available. Jimena has her copy, I have my copies. It's available from Rutgers University Press, and we'll put the link in the chat. But the second kind of exciting surprise is that the book is also, it's already been translated into Spanish, and it's going to be coming out hopefully August, September, with the Ediciones Uniandes from the Universidad de los Andes and FESCO are going to be co-publishing it. So I hope to have some events in Spanish as well to reach not only those policymakers who are in Colombia who maybe want to chat more in Spanish, but also to bring this work back to the women who I have been working with. So just to finish off, I really think that everything I've said over the last 45 minutes, I hope I haven't spoken for longer than that, can truly be summed up in this lema, in this slogan that has become this kind of, you know, cry of social leaders all over Colombia. And it first, as far as I'm aware, it was first said by Cristina Bautista, a national leader who was murdered shortly after she said it, but it has become this rallying cry also for Francia Marquez and also for other social leaders. And what they say is, if they're silent, if we're silent, they'll kill us. If we speak out, they'll kill us. So we may as well speak out. And effectively, in a nutshell, that's high-risk feminism in Colombia today. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you so much to Jimena, to everyone at WOLA for the invitation, and I'm really looking forward to speaking more now.
Well, thank you so much, Julia. Amazing contribution to documenting these amazing social movements and the specificities of gender and female leaders in particular. And it really is a tribute to the resilience of these women and these communities. And I think many have a lot to learn about this. So amazing. So if folks have questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A. We have about 9 minutes. I'm going to throw out one question here to start out, which is, so how did you come up with these specific examples? How did you meet those communities, and why did you pick those communities in particular?
I mean, I would like to say as a social scientist that it was all very rigorously planned out, but I think that the reality of a lot of field work is that I had contacts, I heard stories, and that I decided to go and find people, and that it kind of snowballed from that. And that really was the case with the City of Women. I heard rumors. I was doing some work with the Center for Reproductive Rights in Bogota after I finished my master's, and I heard talk of this City of Women, and it really, you know, struck me and caught my attention. And so with a colleague, we went and found it, and we went up to Cartagena. We started asking around, asking journalists, asking other academics, and we made contact with some of the leaders within the organization. And really it went from there, getting to know them, getting to chat to them. And what I saw were some of these dynamics, all of the dynamics I've talked about, that high risk mobilization, that ongoing push for gender justice, despite the risks associated with doing so. And it kind of made sense to me because I was there with them and I was learning and understanding. But at the same time, I thought this is a really interesting research question. You know, how do they justify these risks that they're running? When it came to Afromupaz, I was invited by the women of the Liga to an event that was being held by the Ministry of Justice around responses to conflict-related sexual violence. And we went to Bogota together, and Maria Eugenia, I think it was Maria Eugenia, or one of her colleagues from Afromupaz, stood up and started speaking. And I thought, I have to know them. I have to get to know these people. They're doing the same thing. And so through that and through those events, through those chains, I got to know these different women and these different organizations. And I think, as you'll know, Jimena, going back month after month, year after year, generates trust, generates friendship, generates solidarity. And I think that, you know, being in Colombia for the last 8 years, as I said, I recently moved here to Mexico, generates an ability to not only the time to listen to those stories, but also a trust in terms of being able to relate them and bring them together in conversation with one another. So I could have picked many others. I know that there are multiple other organizations in the country who are doing the same work under similar conditions of risk, and I hope to continue meeting them as I continue my work. As I was just saying before, I'll be in Cali in the next few weeks. I'll be back up in Cucuta and Catatumbo in the next few weeks, and I'm constantly and surprised and excited to meet these other women who are doing dangerous and very important work under these situations.
Well, speaking of the issue of danger and security, we got two questions that came into the chat, which are basically interrelated. One is, what risks did you have to confront as a writer doing this? And then did you feel that you were in danger, or did your presence endanger other women?
I think that's, it's a great question. I always chose not to live with these women. I kind of, by my inclinations as a researcher, would consider myself a semi-ethnographer. But speaking to the women, it became clear that it wasn't a good idea for me to live in the city of women, or to, be renting a house next door to the house in Usme, because I would just kind of call too much attention as a foreigner, and they didn't want necessarily that attention around them. But at the same time, these are ongoing conversations. And I think that in terms of asking women, can I come today? Can I hang out with you today? I always trusted their judgment, because they know when things are getting too hot and it's a bad idea to be in the communities, and when it's an okay idea, and when in fact having international or foreign accompaniment is a good thing, or offers them some kind of protection. I mean, kind of the background and the morals and ethics of that are definitely questionable, but that is, some of the foundation of organizations like peace brigades, who accompany, who just kind of physically and have their presence there accompanying other organizations, offers a certain veil or level of security. And so these were ongoing conversations. And I relied on the perspectives of the women leaders that I was working with. So some days I just didn't go. Some trips I had, I just didn't take. And others I did. And I never really felt as though I particularly was at threat, although, kind of course, there was always an underlying risk of spending time there.
Great. Well, we've got three other questions, and then I'm going to throw one in there, and I'm just going to go ahead and read them all since we have limited time. One of them is, these organizations, besides embracing several feminist approaches such as ecofeminism or feminismo comunitario, have somehow generated a big influence at the governmental level. How can we translate this in other countries such as the US that recently has been putting more threats on women's rights? Another is, through your research, did you find any effort against human trafficking or smuggling for sexual exploitation of women? Thank you for the information. And then another question we got here is, how or what things help to raise new leadership of women in the context where you have high conflictivity? And then my question is, because you recently wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post about Francia Marquez, is, can you maybe finish off by telling us a bit about what does this Francia Marquez phenomenon that took place during this election mean or symbolize for the feminist movement in Colombia? So I know that these are things that could take an hour, but if you could briefly touch on them, we'd really appreciate it.
Of course, and I'm going to do the annoying thing for the first question, which is, if you read my book, you may find some of those kind of strategies more outlined in a more outlined way, a more analytical way than I talked about today. And so I think that in terms of the US, very different conflict, ooh, that was a Freudian slip, very different context. But I think that there have to be kind of multiple approaches from multiple levels. So there's always, feminism is for everyone, and there always has to be kind of a grassroots movement to push this critical mass of mobilization, but also the people who can speak legal speak and who can speak the same language as lawmakers and those who wield power. Also those who have that policy piece and can actively be working to craft policies that would be a good alternative suggestion. And all of this coming together around, I think particularly in the States, an intersectional understanding of what it means to be feminist and whose rights are included under this umbrella and what that looks like in different communities. But again, I think that that's a much longer question. In my research, no, these women weren't particularly working on human trafficking or smuggling, although a lot of the work that I've done in along the border with Venezuela does focus on that. And there have been a number of women's organizations working there. I do also know of some in Bogota who I don't know as well, but I've spent some time with, who are doing work on human trafficking. And that was something that really manifested in that nexus of armed conflict and mass migration. I don't know that it was necessarily the main problem that the women, or the main kind of threat that the women who I was working with for the context of this book were really facing. I don't remember what the third question was now. I probably should have written it down. It was about, oh, did I meet other international researchers whose work informed yours? Oh my goodness. Absolutely, I worked with others whose work informed mine, and I would look in the kind of like the bibliography. You only can build yourself on the theories of other amazing people, and particularly, I really tried to include a lot of Colombian scholars who are doing this work. I would hope that no one thought that I was exploiting the women I met. I try as much as possible to kind of find ways to bring the research back to the communities and to find other and alternative ways of balancing out that power dynamic. Power dynamics always do exist when you are a global North white researcher working in communities that have very different qualities of life and conditions of life. But I hope to try and balance those out through solidarity and through having these open discussions. And then to you, Jimena, I think the Francia Marquez effect and that Washington Post op-ed came out with Jen Piscopo, who also has amazing research about gender and politics and what women's participation in politics means at a broader scale. I think that Francia Marquez, whether or not she makes it to be the vice president, she, for so many people, is the first time that they have ever heard their experience talked about or seen their experience talked about. And she embodies that. Not only is she talking about Afro-Colombian women, not only is she talking about environmental degradation, not only is she talking about sexism and racism, she's talking about these from having lived them. And I think that there's a certain level of legitimacy that comes with that. This is a woman who took 10 years to get her law degree because she had to stop and was working cleaning houses in between it to make enough money. And she's coming up against and speaking truth to this political and economic and social elite that has always been in power. And so it's not just that she's a woman who is representing women's rights, she's also representing marginalized and vulnerable women's rights and experiences. And so I think, and she's being taken seriously. Again, that question of certification, she's someone that people like, Fico or people like Fajardo have to stand on the same stage with and talk to her as an equal. And I think that that is incredibly powerful for people who've just never seen themselves or their experiences. These people, the nobodies, she says she represents the nobodies of Colombia. And frankly, the nobodies of Colombia are also able to vote, and they're also able to go out and make their political preferences heard. And so I think that it really is in this heightened moment of polarization, with this kind of shadow of violence and impending violence as the elections come up, frankly remarkable that she has managed to get to this position, particularly because of all of these barriers that she's overcome to get there. I know we're a little over time, so maybe I think we'll leave it there.
Yes. Unfortunately, we're going to have to close up, but I really appreciate all the time you took with us to explain your book. Everyone should go get a copy. And also when it comes out in Spanish in Colombia, everyone in Colombia should get a copy. And we also really look forward to the other scholarship that you'll be doing, especially on the border. Everything that you've mentioned sounds fascinating. I want to thank everyone for participating. And if anybody has any further questions, please just contact us, and we're happy to put you in touch with Dr. Zulver directly. So have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone.